Nintendo's investor Q&A took place a few days ago, but it has only just been translated for their website into English. While I know a lot of news sites covered it based primarily on machine translations, I think it's interesting where possible to see Nintendo's wording, since their official translation will, one assumes, hew closer to their intended meaning, especially in a language like Japanese, where the people tend to use more nuance. I will put the images of the questions on screen so you can pause and read for yourself if you wish. There are some quite interesting answers, and we'll do a bit of analysis on them as we go. First of all, it's interesting to note that we have both Shuntaro Furukawa and Hajime Murakami in attendance. Attendance in these meetings varies considerably. Sometimes more people are in attendance, including better-known names such as Miyamoto and the senior managing executive officer of the hardware and software part of Nintendo's business, Shinya Takahashi, better known for his role in Directs. We've also seen people like Satoru Shibata, once the head of Nintendo Europe and now in charge of global marketing, as well as a few other people. This session, however, being only a quarterly update rather than one of the year-end meetings, has just 2 people. Murakami is far from a household name, even in the Nintendo commentary space, but he is the executive officer with direct responsibility for finance, which seems to be broadly the same kind of background as Furukawa and his predecessor. The first question relates to the reason for the changes in Nintendo's earning projections. He mentions a fair few factors in response, including exchange rate changes, but primarily Furukawa is conveying his judgment that Switch 2 anticipation had a minimal effect on the sales of Switch this year, and whether you believe him or not really, what else could he say in this position? It would be hugely counterproductive for the company to say that people bypassing Switch would be in any way justified in this decision. However, I think it's interesting that he identifies that they did not have a single game driving momentum and attracting consumer interest. Clearly, Super Mario Party Jamboree was positioned as their biggest seller, and with over 5 million sold, it's clearly a big success. But it's true that this is not the kind of game to kickstart momentum, but rather to ride momentum. I think that's a useful way to think about it. It's difficult to imagine that quite so many people would have bought a Switch in 2017 if the launch game was Super Mario Party Jamboree as opposed to Zelda Breath of the Wild. And we can all feel tacitly where one game is, for most players, more exciting than the other, but this gives a business explanation for that difference, the potential for momentum. A game that gets players to invest dozens or hundreds of hours right off in a highly engrossing, conversation-prompting experience is obviously going to drive more people towards the system much more quickly, and one assumes that Nintendo will be very keen to have the same effect on the new system, which probably means a lot riding on the next 3D Mario, I would guess. The second question addresses the response from customers and software developers to the teaser video, a question which Furukawa-san essentially ducks, saying only that the April Direct will allow a good sense to be felt. My guess is that Nintendo is keen not to commentate or hype on the announcement, and while the reception has broadly been positive, there has inevitably been some negative backlash. If you respond to any of it, you raise the salience of all of it, so better to just say that there is more to come, and let's wait and see how people take it. Of course, you could also interpret it that they have more up their sleeve, and they kind of must do, games if nothing else. The next question directly addresses pricing, and while the answer is slightly vague, there are some very interesting details, and for this I will quote the specific wording. He says, "We are aware that, in addition to how inflation is currently proceeding, the exchange rate environment has also changed significantly since around the time we launched Nintendo Switch in 2017. We also need to consider the price range that consumers expect for Nintendo products. We think a multifaceted consideration of these factors is needed when deciding on the price of a product. I cannot tell you a specific price for Nintendo Switch 2 at this time, but we are taking various factors into account." So a few things here interest me. Firstly, exchange rates. In January of 2017, when the Switch was ready for launch, there was roughly an exchange rate of 114 yen to the dollar. This January, it is around 157. Theoretically, therefore, and assuming that no other measures were taken to ameliorate currency risk, which clearly wouldn't be the case for a company as large and as cautious as Nintendo, but theoretically, this means that they would make the same profit off the Switch that they made in 2017 if they priced the Switch at $220 out of the gate if it launched in 2025. Moreover, if they were to price the Switch 2 very competitively at $300, it would still be like a console priced at nearly $400 in 2017 terms. Essentially, if Furukawa takes into account the exchange rate, Nintendo could well be a lot more aggressive in the American and European markets as foreign currencies convert very healthily into Japanese yen right now. The risk is that this might apply to the currency situation as it stands, but isn't a very future-proofed point of view. The USA aspires to devalue its currency to bolster its export market, while Japan's long-term goal is to strengthen the currency to increase domestic consumption. Now, aspirations might not become reality, and we saw last August's fluctuation in the Japanese market show that things do not always go to plan. Nevertheless, it does seem like it would be risky to commit to a price point that is liable to be exposed by a change in the exchange rates. Still, Furukawa didn't need to reference either of these factors in his answer. He could have talked about the cost of parts, the difficulty of manufacture, the need to maintain the value of Nintendo's offer in the marketplace, all things that would be true. The fact that he did comment feels to me like he is preparing investors subtly for a lower price than might be expected by them at least. I do think this nudges up the likelihood of a $400 price point quite a bit, although it's difficult to imagine that they would want to go any lower. Adjusted for inflation, $400 certainly fits the standard expectation for a Nintendo console, and while the Switch 2 evidently has a lot more to it than the original Switch did, perhaps they feel the exchange rates can help cushion the blow of a lower price, at least for the first couple of years. Question 4 reflects something I noted in my video on the investor report, that the forecast for the January to March quarter doesn't seem to suggest an expectation for any great sales. This isn't really a question that Furukawa addresses particularly, other than saying that they have evergreen titles, an engaged user base, and the games we already know about coming to the console. I still think it's difficult to imagine that they won't do a February title, given that there's such an unusually long gap between the early January release of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD and Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, but equally, there's a chance that such a title could be very small or ultra-casual, hardly likely, therefore, to excite the market. Equally, while it's unlikely, it is possible that they could go a longer period without a release. They have had long waits not broken until the spring, such as in 2021 between Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury and new Pokemon Snap. During the pandemic, sure, but still a long gap. And also between Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Bayonetta 1 and 2 in 2018, but that was the early days for the Switch. The 9-week gap between Donkey Kong Country Returns and Xenoblade Chronicles X would be well on the upper end of Switch first-party gaps, but not completely unprecedented. And if they really see Switch as in the wind-down period, perhaps it makes sense to hold on. Question 5 talks about the role of smartphones, and the question references Nintendo Music and Everybody Want to Switch as games which integrate smartphones, as well as their plans to enhance the Nintendo account system and use smartphones to increase the fun and accessibility of their products. However, Furukawa chooses a different focus, not looking at the Switch adjacent stuff like Everybody Want to Switch, but mobile content in its own right. What's interesting is that he frames the smartphone app strategy as particularly to approach regions where dedicated gaming is not as prevalent. He notes that from September 2024, there were 900 million unique downloads across all the Nintendo apps, which is huge, and he notes that currently Fire Emblem Heroes, Mario Kart Tour, and Super Mario Run are directly operated by Nintendo, as well as mentioning other apps like Pikmin Bloom and the for-purchase version of Animal Crossing Pocket Camp. He does specifically confirm that they are focused on new mobile game applications, and of course we have seen examples of this back along with patents specifically linked to Nintendogs on smartphones. He makes the specific point that for some users their first gaming device is now a phone rather than a console, and this inevitably has consequences for Nintendo's plans, as well as noting that they want to expand customer engagement beyond gaming hardware. So look, none of this is exactly new. We already understood that Nintendo's broader strategy of leveraging its IP relied on multiple tactics, including using smartphone apps to tacitly promote games. But the fact that Nintendo is explicitly focused on smartphone games still is interesting to see, and I wonder if the fact that they are now looking at this as a way to bolster their appeal in parts of the world in which they have, until now, not been very competitive, suggests that future smartphone applications may still have particular regions in mind. Question 6 relates to Switch 2 production, and it's clear that they are going hell for leather to produce as many as possible, especially by contrast with the Switch, which in the early days had significant stock shortages due to problems in manufacturing. He suggests that the actual demand will be judged based on the April Direct. This is quite curious as a statement. On one level, he could be being quite literal in that pre-orders will probably be going in after the April showcase, and so they will literally know how many they require and can allocate accordingly. Another implication is that by revealing the full extent of what Switch 2 offers, they expect audience anticipation to either increase or at least be different as a consequence. Now, this might simply be because they are revealing specific games and experiences, but it could also suggest that they have something else about the system itself that will, as per the company motto, surprise and delight. It's good that they're taking previous experiences into account, as stock has long been an issue at launch, not just for Nintendo's main consoles, but also amiibo, special editions, mini versions of consoles, and more. It will reflect well on Furukawa's management capabilities if he can navigate a way around these issues. Question 7 is interesting, noting an increase in inventory levels in the third quarter, and there is a confirmation that they are building up inventory in anticipation of launching Switch 2. This suggests that current Switch manufacturers will pivot to manufacturing Switch 2, which is unsurprising but does also open the question of whether reduced outputs of particular consoles will make it less cost-effective to continue to produce them. Nintendo has put out multiple variants previously of its consoles, but just as they pulled the 3DS XL from the market the financial year before the Switch launch and iced the new Nintendo 3DS as they geared up the new 2DS XL, it is possible that they will make a decision about whether they will still want 3 Switch consoles in production concurrent with the Switch 2. With a good deal of inventory backed up, they don't have to worry about announcements for the medium term of these consoles, and probably they could put their foot on the gas with production of any of these if for some reason demand of a particular variant system seemed especially resilient in the Switch 2 era, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did have consoles they wish to retire. Question 8 returns to the sales forecasts, and there's not really very much more to say here. It's interesting but hardly surprising that evergreens represent an increase in the proportion of Nintendo's first-party sales. If you don't have as many high-selling new games, then of course the proportion of evergreens will look higher, especially compared to a financial year boasting both Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. My suspicion, as I explained in my previous video, is that they pitched for the most ambitious target that they thought was justifiable in the figures in order to project confidence at that time, which seems fair enough. Question 9 relates to the Playtest program. Of the Playtest specifically, very little is revealed, but he does talk about the number of subscribers fluctuating. Although we have had acknowledgement previously that the number of Nintendo Switch Online subscribers has dipped, this is the first time that he's talked in terms of the apparent drivers of subscriptions, specifically online compatible titles and changes in hardware sales volume. Neither of these are astonishing exactly, but it does suggest that he will want to be quite tactical about the deployment of their online-focused games in order to keep people involved. The membership seems to have stayed fairly stable at 34 million, and that is a decent number. I think it will be very interesting to see where this number goes long term. Maintaining such a huge base will be a challenge in itself, but unless they can top the Switch's incredible wealth of players, it seems difficult to believe that they will manage to push it further. It's possible that some people who sat out on the Switch might like the idea of a more powerful Switch 2, particularly for mobile third-party games, the Steam Deck-style crowd, and they may come on board for the first time. Of course, Nintendo also at some point may need to revise how they monetize the service. This is going to be a tricky balance for them, as they won't want people to jump off it, and certainly not in the next couple of years as they are transitioning to their new console. Furukawa also says that they will continue to offer comprehensive services, which isn't quite the same as saying that they will continue to enhance the existing service, though it's difficult to believe that they won't try to do this. The final question is particularly interesting, as Furukawa acknowledges that there will be further Switch games while saying that they must be focused on exclusive software as being important to Switch 2. Okay, so far, so much that we could guess, but he does talk about ensuring that Nintendo games remain accessible across both consoles. Let's quote the specifics, as I think this is worth a bit of a deep dive. He says, "So far we have announced Pokemon Legends ZA and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond as Nintendo Switch titles scheduled for release in 2025. No comment there on whether they're Switch 2 as well. Since many people are playing Nintendo Switch, if we are able to develop appealing software, we would like to continue releasing new titles. On the other hand, exclusive games are crucial when launching new hardware. With this in mind, we will consider various ways for Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2 to encourage as many consumers as possible to enjoy our games. If we are able to develop appealing software is an interesting twist. Does this suggest that they see the appeal of Switch 1 as being separate from here on out? What would qualify as appealing on Switch 1 but not Switch 2? I could well imagine them skewing younger or more casual, as the late era 3DS also did, but it does seem a curious turn of phrase. As well as this, considering various ways for these systems to encourage as many consumers as possible to enjoy games may be tricky when one console's install base so comprehensively outpaces the other, at least for the present. Is there a way they have to work around this? How this could work specifically remains open to the imagination, but I do believe it is likely that demos of Switch 2 games at the bare minimum could be accessible to Switch owners, if only through game streaming, something that they have tried before, albeit not so much on a first-party basis. I have quite a few thoughts on this, but this will be the subject of a separate video, currently exclusive to Patreon, exploring a potential left-field possibility in the Switch to Switch 2 transition. For now, though, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to the Patreon supporters of this channel, and please do like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.